Hello, this is Derek with Reef Automation Tutorials for Neptune Systems. Today I'm going to go over the basics of programming in Apex, kind of going over where the icons are, where certain features are, how to get things going. Also go over some basic programming, go over some basic probe calibration, just go over the basics of the Neptune Systems infrastructure. So let's get started. So when you first get your Apex, you're going to go to your Apex local dashboard. Now to get to this, you're going to either type in the IP address of the Apex itself, or you're going to type in apex.local in your browser. It's going to then pull you up with a sign-in. The default username and password for all Apex systems are admin1234 as the password. So again, that's admin as the username and 1234 as the password. When you first get into your controller, it's not going to look like this. It's going to have a number of things not labeled. It's going to show you everything that's in your system, but the key that you need to find is the Apex Fusion. It's usually going to show you a token number, and you need to write that down. For me, since I have my Apex running now, it shows me that Apex Fusion is okay, which means it shows up in Fusion. So if we go to apexfusion.com and we click on the little token icon here, you would type in that number that you just wrote down, and therefore it would then connect your Apex to Fusion, and therefore you would have the ability in which to control your Apex from outside of your house. The controller you can also control from outside your house, but you'd have to port forward the ports to get into it from the outside of the house. So once you get that going, you'll see it'll show up your system. It typically will say Apex, which is the host name of the Apex system. Now, if you go up here, you can do a couple things. The first thing that's important here is that you can go to settings. You can set up your Alexa account. You can set up your display, how you want it to look on touch screens. Now, I'll go over this a little bit. Now, the covers mean that if you're using a touchscreen device, such as an iOS or an Android device, it's going to put these little covers or transparency covers that allow you to not control it unless you slide the covers over. You can also turn that off if you want, and you can also turn it on all devices. So, for instance, if I turn it on all devices, you're going to see now that if I go to my Fusion dashboard, all of my devices now have covers on them, which means I can't switch them unless I take the cover off. Okay. Another quick key right here is this guy. This guy allows you to turn off all the covers on everything. Now again, the covers are there so you don't accidentally turn on and off things. So generally what I recommend is that you go back to display and you just do it on your iOS devices or your Android devices. On the computer, more than likely you're not going to accidentally click on it. So you can show the list, or you can just show yours. That's if you're controlling multiple apexes. You can also show the compressed version or the expanded version, and I'll show you what those look like. If we click on this and we go back to our list, you can see it'll just show names and it won't show all the extra information. Now if we go back to settings and we go back to display and we go back to expanded, you will see that it'll show all of my probes in the system and what they are currently. So depending on how you want to do this, this is probably the easiest way to see everything that you want to see. A couple other settings in here. This is where you can change your password to Fusion. This is where you set up your notifications, so you can add a notification if you want to get a notification via email or text. This is where you set that up. I use push notifications, so once you install the app onto your phone or onto your tablet, it'll automatically ask you if you want to use notifications, and then it will automatically add it to this list. You can test it right here if you want to. You can also disable it right here if you want to. We're not going to do that. In your profile, you could put your address, you could put your email address, and then you can turn on tours. Now, tours have the ability to basically show you how to do certain things. I have them turned on, but generally you can turn them off. It's basically little tool tips to tell you when things, how to do things in the system. So we'll go back to the main page, which is Apex list, and we're going to go into the Apex. Now, if you click on here, this is where you're going to enable and disable your heartbeat. Now, anytime you get a new Apex, and also if you currently have an Apex and you do not have heartbeat turned on, I highly recommend it. This is where you can enable and disable the heartbeat, What the heartbeat does is anytime your system loses internet, so it could be your Apex lost internet or it could be your house lost internet, it's going to send you a text or an email to your phone or to whatever device you're using for notifications, and it's going to tell you, hey, we haven't received a heartbeat or communication with the Apex in more than 30 minutes. You probably need to go check on it. So I recommend everyone turning on Heartbeat. One thing about Heartbeat is you cannot turn it on until your Apex has been running for more than 24 hours and connected to the internet. So just be aware of that. Adopt data is a good feature if you are going to take from one Apex to another. Now that does not mean the classic Apex. This means any of the newer Apex. You can just copy over your data from one to the other. Now the data specifically is going to be your log data, and that is your pH data, your salt data, and so forth. This is not your backup of the system, which we'll go over in a few minutes here. You can also, of course, remove it from Fusion, and then you'd have to take the token back. So we're going to click on this. We're going to go over some of the specific features of when you're in Fusion. So the first one's the simple one. Click on this. That'll get you right back to the Apex list. You can also get back to any of those features by going to here. So these little icons here are going to also be the icons here. So, for instance, this is your alarms. If we go over here, this is the same thing, alarm log. So if we click on our alarm, this tells you if we've had any alarms today. For instance, if I go to the 12th, it tells me that I had an alarm on the 12th, tells me what the alarm was. And those alarms come from the alarm outlet, which is right here, the alarm outlet. So again, you can click on any of these and they correspond to the icons that are right here. A couple things that are not there are going to be your diagnosis. Right here, you'll notice that it's not on the list there. So that's one thing, and also your dashboard, which is what we're on right now. Okay, but pretty much everything else is on here. So the next one's going to be your charts. So this will give you kind of logs of different probes, different ports, pretty much anything in the system that you want, it'll show you. So for instance, if I want to see my pH, I can go on to pH and it'll show me my pH. So if I want to go to my temperature, I can see my temperature. I can also put on a compare, and what's nice is I can compare, okay, my ozone was on during this period of time. I can also do, let's say, my alkalinity, and this tells me when my alkalinity was dosed during certain periods of time. It'll also show you in a list right here. It'll show your average and your maximum. You can slide this back and forth to show you specific areas or specific days. You can click on this guy right here, and it will give you by hour, by day, or even by the last 7 days, I believe. If you slide the slider over here, you can go as far back as you want. You'll see as you go farther back, so we're going back to March of this year, and today is May 18th. It's going to take quite a while to get back there. But once it does, you'll be able to see your information from that day. So after you have viewed the logs, you'll notice that all the logs automatically are shown for your probes. Now, if you want to see your outputs, you have to enable those logs. So for instance, fish scrub right here, if I wanted to enable that log, I'd have to go to fish scrub and I'd have to enable the log right here. Now what this means is that it will record your log of when your pump has been on or when your pump has been off and so forth. So you got to make sure that you enable that log on specific ports, and then it will show up right here. Okay, and that's in your charts feature or your input log. I call it the charts. Another way you can get your charts is very easily by clicking on the chart itself. So for instance, if I want to get my pH, I just click on the log right here, and I will get my log of the unit. Now sometimes it takes a little while. There it goes. So again, just click on the pH and you'll get your log. Now you'll notice anytime I want to change anything, I hit the little gear icon on the upper right hand corner. The gear icon will show me the configuration for each probe or each outlet. For probes, you will see that you have the ability to set an alarm internally in the probe. You can also set up the advanced settings. You can change what you want your minimum and what you want your maximum to be. And again, you can use what the recommended values are right here. Anytime you make a change, by the way, you need to hit the little cloud icon, and you will see it changes color when you've indicated something that you want to change. So for instance, if we go back to our salinity monitor and we change use recommended values, this turns orange, which means you're going to have to save it or apply it, and that's what the cloud does. So again, that's probes. That's basically how you get into probes. That's how you get the charts of the probes. You'll see I have a number of different devices here. If you want to change an outlet, you'll click on the gear icon, and this is where the programming of the outlet is. You can always make a pre-programmed type, so always means that outlet will always be on or off. You can set it up for an ATO. You can set it up for a chiller. You can set it up for a feeder. And again, these are pre-programmed systems for you right here. Or PEEP control, pH control, power head. Most of them, of course, I program manually. And again, anytime you make a program change, you have to save it. So as long as the outlet is in auto, which is pretty much all of mine, it'll use the programming in which you set here. So for instance, if I was to set this to always on, and I set the switch itself back here to auto, that means it's going to be on. But I can manually turn off and on switches as I see fit. So for instance, I can turn off my alarm at any time I want. You see that? And that's what this allows you to do. So if you want to just turn off and on outlets, you want to turn off and on different things, you can just use the tabs. But generally, most of them will be on auto because most of them will be programmed for you. If you have a switch or a sensor, you're going to see open and closed. Now, depending on which sensor you are working with, open will generally mean that there is no water, and closed will generally mean that there is water, depending on the sensor. Now, it could be a leak sensor, it could be an optical sensor. As if you're using a flow sensor, you're going to get a flow meter over here. So this is a flow sensor right here. Obviously, you can see the time right here. The time will be in 24-hour time, not 12 time. These are different feed cycles. These are manual logs. So if you wanted to manually log something, you go click on calcium. You can pick your test kit, and then you can put your reading, and this will give you logs on manual testing. So you can put that in there as well. So anytime you click on the log feature, you can click on the plus feature up here, and you can log any type you want. You can even click other, and you can make it whatever you want. You can make it salinity. You can make it, hey, I did this at a certain point, and then it'll put it on there and tell you what it is. So that's measurements. So a couple other things. When you're using your dashboard, there's the lock and unlock. Now, the lock and unlock button here allows you to move around the panels to where you want them. It also allows you to delete them to where you want them, and also lets you add and delete devices that might not be on the dashboard. So I have a lot of different things. So let's say I wanted to add a camera feed. I put the camera feed right there, and now I have a camera feed. Now, I don't use the camera feed, but we'll go over that real quick. You go to the gear, hit the plus, and then you can add a camera feed. Now, a camera feed must come from a camera that supports HTTP live streaming MPEG-4, which is generally an RTSP feed, OGG, or WebM. You can also just put a motion JPEG or an image. Now, a motion JPEG is generally a GIF file, and it will just be an image that you can sit right there. So an image of your tank, for instance. HTTP streams are typically from cameras that don't have a lot of security, and RTSP streams are generally ones that require a password and username. You put the URL in there, and you can put, if you want certain people to be able to see it, you put view, control, program, manage, depending on the user that's using it. And we'll go over users here in a moment. Okay, so the next one is going to be your output chart. So this is basically, like I said, if you're logging something, it'll tell you when things have turned on and when things have turned off. So you'll see my Reef ATO turned on at 9:40 and it turned off at 9:41. And you can pretty much go through the whole day and take a look at everything and every day in which what happened. Again, you need to have the log enabled on that outlet to see that type of information. The next one is only if you have an EB832 on the system, and this calculates your power usage throughout the day on only the EB832. So that's what this will do. I don't really use that, but that'll show you your power consumption. Calendar's nice. You could put tasks, you can put reminders in here. So if you put a specific calendar event for a specific person, and then you can create a note if you want. You can create a title text, when you want it to happen, if it's scheduled, reoccurring, and what it will do is it'll alert you on your phone during that point if you want to put a reminder into the calendar. I don't use the calendar. I use my phone's calendar instead, but that's a nice little feature. The next one is the logs of your manual input devices. So what I mean by that is your measurements. That's what this little beaker means. So the beaker is the same thing as this button that we pressed earlier. Okay, the next one is going to be notes. So you could put in little notes here and there. Hey, I screwed up on this day, or hey, this was a bad day, that my pH was this. I don't use notes, but that's a nice feature. If you want to remind yourself of something, you can put a note in there. Probably one of the more important ones here is the tasks. So what's nice about tasks is it'll automatically do a number of programs for you. One thing that is important to know, that if you're not familiar with how to program something, generally it'll be in the tasks. So for instance, if you don't know how to program a flow sensor, here it is, configure a flow sensor. If you don't know how to attach an ITOA device or something like an AI Prime Lite, it's really cool because it's right here. You could put a power usage alarm. This is how you program the power usage alarms. There's a lot of stuff for Tridents. If you're configuring a wave pump, here's how you configure your Trident schedule. I have a whole video on how to program the Trident, which you can go over. But basically, this is tasks, and I find the tasks to be very important for people that haven't really programmed yet. This will get you going. This is an expand button, so when you push this, it'll give you a number of more options. So the next one is going to be your flow chart. Now, I don't use the flow chart, but I have found that people use it quite regularly. And what's really neat about the flow chart is it'll tell you what's hooked up into everything here. So for instance, I can click on variable or virtual outlets, and it'll tell me what all my virtual outlets are. I can click on them and then program them from here. This will tell me all my probes that are hooked up to the main system. But then I can, of course, go to a PM2, which tells me that I have a temp sensor for my office and an office salinity sensor. So this is really handy if you need a quick reference or you need to find something real quick. If you're not sure what's plugged in, if you have a lot of stuff, this is really helpful because it'll tell you what's plugged in. So for instance, my garage EB4, it tells me that these are the 4 outlets that are plugged into it. So if I needed to find something quickly, if I need to know what's plugged into my EB8, this is a good feature right here. Again, this is right here. You click on the expand, and this is the tree, a little tree table looking thing. This will give you kind of a big system diagram of your whole system. The next one is output. So when you click on outputs, this tells you if the log has been enabled. It tells you what type it is. You can have it organized by type. You can have it organized by name. So if you want to find a specific virtual outlet, that's how you would find it. You can then click on that outlet specifically. So Reef feeder, I can click on it and then I can program it and go right back to outlets here. So that's a really quick feature to get to your outlets. So the next one is going to be profiles. It looks like a folder. Profiles are something that I've went over in another video, which you'll want to take a look at more in detail, but profiles are generally static commands that you can set specific things to go to. So for instance, if I want my lighting to go to a specific spectrum on a button press, I can program a profile to do that. And again, I would take a look at the profiles video on how to do profiles. Next one's authentication or users, which are the 2 little guys. This is where you can add users to be able to view, control, manage, or program your device. Let's say you have a friend that's really good with Apex and you don't want to mess with the programming. You can add them to this so that they can come in here and manage your Apex for you. That's where you would add them, and you add them by their username. Next one is modules. This is a very important one. Now, modules will tell you if the software is up to date. It'll tell you your address, and it will tell you the name and what it is. And again, this is all just Apex devices. So you'll see I have roughly 36 devices. It gives me the name. It tells me if it's online, if it needs an update. I can also go right to it. I can configure it, update the software, or delete it if I want to. One thing that's kind of cool is if you go to an FMM, for instance, you can configure each sensor to be what type of flow it is, or if it's a optical sensor. I typically just put this on auto detect. So we'll go back to here. So this is your modules. Next one's going to be probes. That's the little thermometer. This is going to show you all your probes or all your sensors basically in the system. You have switches, you got power, you got connectivity, temperature, amperage. These are all your different sensors in the system. And you can see if they are turned on or not being used, for instance, by this little guy. And it'll tell you if you have the notification set up for it. Now, again, the notifications are set up internally in the sensor itself. It has nothing to do with your programming of your alarm or your email texting alerts. This is built into the Apex and will automatically alert you if something happens. Keep in mind that anytime you program something into your sensor, that it's going to override your alarm or email outlets. So that will always take precedence over this. So you can either program it through the probe, which is right here, or you can program it into your email itself. I generally choose to program it in both, and it just depends on what I'm using it for. So we're going to get rid of this picture. We're going to put this back up there, and that gets rid of that guy. Okay, so the next one's the clock. Pretty simple. This is where you set up your clock. I just have it on automatic clock setup. Most people will use that. Here in Arizona, we don't have daylight savings, so it's going to always be disabled. It'll always tell you the clock of Apex, which means the clock that's in Apex headquarters or where Fusion is located, wherever their server's located, and then, of course, your local clock, which is right here. Next one is going to be your display. If you have any displays set up in your system, any Apex displays, you can set up how you want to see them. So for instance, if I want to see the clock on the top line, I want to see my alkalinity and calcium on lines 1 and 2, and then I want to see my pH and salt on lines 3. These will show you if outlets are on or off. I generally don't use that, but you could hit visible, and then you can tell which device is on and off by its little icon. Now the little icon, I will show you where that comes from. So if you go back to the outlet, and you go right to here, icon. So you can set up the icon that shows up on your display right here. And like I said, I don't use that. I choose to use an iPad on the wall to tell me if things are on or off. But that's a nice little feature. This is your setup icon. So this is where you set up your feed modes. This is where you set up your different noises depending on if it's an alarm or a warning. And again, you need a display for that. This is where you enable and disable power management, which I did a video on power management, which I would highly recommend you watch. This tells you when your power is gone from your Apex. This tells you how long you want your data log to be. I generally want that every minute. Depending on the sensor, you might want it every couple minutes, but generally 1 minute is fine, and that's how I set up mine. The next one we're going to go to is the internet or Wi-Fi setup. Can't do much in here, but if you go to configure, you can set up your HTTP port and you can set up your host name, which we went over earlier, which is what shows up on your list. So we go to Wi-Fi, which I'm not using. You can disable, enable, and then of course if you want to use the old email, which is the SMTP server, which you don't need to do anymore, you can set it up here. HTTP port, like I said, if you wanted to port forward your Apex to use it through your local controller, or if you wanted to log into the Apex itself outside of your home, this is where you would port your port. Generally, you want to not change that and keep that at 80. And if you ever were to change that, you're going to need to put a colon and then whatever the new port is on the back end of the address. So generally don't change that. So that's network. The next one is going to be your voice control. So this is where you can set up your Amazon Alexa control right here. So what you can do with it is it'll give you a status report. If you just say status report, it'll give you a status report and you can add specific things. I did an entire video on this as well, so if you want to take a look at that, it'll explain how you set this up, but that's where your voice control is. So right here is a nice thing. If you go to information, this tells you kind of basically what we went over. It gives you tips, how to do certain things, what some of the icons are, basically what I just went over. If you go up here, you can contact support. You can look at the manual. So a couple nice features up here. One of the best features and one of the things that is not something that is shown is the summary. So if you click on the upper left-hand corner where your host name is and you go to summary, this is a very handy tool. This will tell you all of your addresses and all your devices. It'll also show you all of your sensors and inputs. It'll also show you all of your programming and what you have programmed on each one, which is really cool. Again, if you ever need to get just an idea of what something's programmed real quick, you go to your summary. Another reason you'd want this is, let's say something ever happened to your Apex, you would definitely want to know what something was programmed for. So I highly recommend that you print this or save it as a PDF on your computer, so that way you have a log of everything. And that's right here. You print this and you can print it, and most computers will give you the save as PDF feature, and I would highly recommend you keep a copy of that. You can search for specific things or go to specific things from the summary page right here. So that's really neat. So that's the summary page. Now, one thing I haven't shown you is the miscellaneous setup, or the setup icon, is different when you're in Fusion and when you're on local. So if you go to local, and you know it's local because it'll have a dark banner on the top. That's how you know you're on local, by the way. You'll notice when you go to local, it gives you a little more features on the setup page. It gives you the sunset and moon ability. If you want to use that feature right here, you can set up the different times for each one of these. These are preset from the factory, so generally you don't want to touch those. But the most important feature is the backup and restore feature. So this is where you can save and load your Apex. You cannot do that from Fusion, so you must do that from your local. Now, when I say local, that means that you're at your home and you're connecting directly to your Apex. So we'll go back to our Fusion. So a couple other small details to notice is that there are 3 columns here that you can work with. Now, how I set mine up is I put my fish tank in the middle column, I put my reef tank on the left column, and I put my automatic water changes and my dosing on the right column. You can set this up however you want, but just remember there are 3 columns, so each column has a limited amount of space. There are not 4 columns, there are not 5 columns, there are 3 columns. So anyway, that's the basics of Apex and how you control different things. This is where also the heartbeat is, by the way, where you can enable and disable it. So that's another thing under your name. But as you can see, it's pretty simple to use an Apex system. It's pretty simple to program it. I've done a number of videos on more advanced programming. But when you first set up your Apex, that's basically all the different icons and what all the icons do. And again, if you're not sure what an icon is, you can always just click up here and get right to it. So if you're not sure where tasks are, you can just click on it right here. And that's pretty much it. So I hope you liked this video. I hope it taught you some basics of how to use the Apex. If you have any specific questions, please just leave a comment in the comment section. If you liked the video, please hit the thumbs up. And if you're not subscribed to my channel, go ahead and subscribe and hit the bell icon, as I do videos on a number of programming titles for Apex. I also do live streams every week. So hope to see you at the live stream, and appreciate your watching today. Thank you very much.